Okay, welcome back. So today I'm going to be showing you how to make a membrane scene in Blender. There are several other tutorials already on YouTube showing how to make various membrane scenes and how to make phospholipid bilayers. But what I wanted to really do is take advantage of some new tools that have only just come out with the most recent version of Blender, so 2.92, called geometry nodes. Now, this is the future of modeling in 3D, and it can help you do it procedurally, much less work, much more organic and sort of random looking. And it's really the way that the industry is going, and especially the way that Blender is going. And so that's why now with the release of the tool, I wanted to do my own tutorial on how to make a membrane scene and show you how to do it using geometry nodes. If you've done any kind of programming before, this will be really quite nice. If you haven't done programming, it may be a little bit of a jump. But thankfully it's visual programming, so it's using nodes just like we've been using in the shader editor. So we're going to use that to basically build up our scene and randomly place stuff and distribute stuff across the scene. Let's get started. Here I am in Blender 2.92, and I'm just going to basically start with my blank scene. To begin with, let's delete the default cube and add in a plane. So we've got just our plane here, and this plane is ultimately what we're going to use to build up our membrane scene. And we're going to start by doing that programmatically, well, generatively. So if we press tab and go into edit mode, you'll see that there are 4 vertices and there's 1 face. So what we're going to do is we're going to need more vertices in the scene, because ultimately what we're going to do is make these go up and down. But you can see if you just put one up and the others down, you don't have enough vertices in the scene to make it sort of look like a properly flowing, say, membrane or surface. So if I Control Z that, what we could do is press A to select all the vertices and click Subdivide. And we could add in more vertices. And then if we were, say, to click that, we could move stuff up like that, or we could turn proportional editing on, move stuff up like that, and do it manually. But I prefer to do things as procedurally as possible, so you can change parameters, basically rebuild the entire scene later on. So we're going to do basically everything programmatically. So I'm going to Control Z, and we see we're back to basically 4 vertices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a modifier. So we've dealt with the subdivision surface modifier before, but we haven't really dealt with anything else. So what I'm going to do is add a subdivision surface. And now what it's doing, it's subdividing basically. And so it's doing it on all those corners, but I'm going to turn it to simple. So now it's not going to do it on the corners. It's only going to do it on the surface. And however many levels you have is however many extra vertices it's going to have in between. Now be careful with setting this to a high number. It will crash your computer. I'm just going to leave it on 2 for now, and we'll come back to that. We're going to add another modifier called displace. And so this takes some information and displaces your geometry based on that information. And what we're going to give it is we're going to give it a texture. So press the plus to give it a new texture. And you can either press this little button here, or just come down to the texture tab. And so this texture is currently what is displacing your mesh. And so currently it's blank. So let's go to clouds. And so what's happening, it's feeding this cloud information into the displace, and that displace is then displacing the resulting mesh. You can see not a whole lot is happening. That's because currently there's not really a whole lot of geometry inside here. So if we turn this up, so levels in viewport, you can see that the more you add, the more smoother the definition of these bumps become, because you're adding in more geometry, and importantly, you're doing it programmatically. So if we wanted to, we could press tab, go into edit mode, select these vertices. You can press E to extrude, so you're basically extruding more vertices. You can click and then press tab, and now you've just made a slightly bigger membrane. And so if we had instead gone about it through the other way, so if I add another plane, and then we subdivide, say 20, and then we grab this side and we extrude, we can see that this portion has lots of geometry, but this has none. So if you were to apply this displace onto can see that it displaces over here, but it doesn't displace over here. So this is what I mean by doing things programmatically. So I can go back to here and change this around if I want. Probably going to leave it at 6 just so it doesn't end up crashing our computers, and just make sure you turn that up to 6 in your render as well, because if we were to say leave that at 2 and look through our camera, so you can either click camera, or what I like to do is press tilde on the keyboard. So that's the one just underneath the escape key, tilde, and that will bring up this view here, and then press 1, or you can click for the camera, so 1 for the camera. So you can see this is what we see in our camera, but if we were to press F12 and render, it's actually not a lot of geometry going on. That's because our levels in viewport and render is different. So let's just turn that back up. Now if we were to press F12, it matches basically what we're seeing, which is good. Let's get a move on. We're going to change the size of this noise, these clouds, so something maybe like that. So we're getting this sort of undulating pattern, which is what you might see on a membrane. It's not going to be a perfectly flat thing. And now we can start adding lipids. You can, if you want, source lipids from a structural file. We're just going to make more of a cartoonistic representation of some lipids. So if we press Shift A, mesh, and a cube, we've got our cube. I like to just say basically, so you can press Control 2, and that adds a subdivision surface modifier, or you can say subsurface, and we can over here apply, or press Control A to apply. And now we have this cube. We're gonna go into edit mode, and down the bottom here press 3, so you can switch between selecting vertices, edges, which are these parts, or faces. So now if I click, I'll select a face instead of vertices where I select individual vertices. So I select a face, press E to extrude, and let's select that face, E to extrude, E, E, and I'm clicking each time, so let's go E, E. Cool, so now we have something that's starting to look like a lipid. If we stay in edit mode and press 1, and if you press Shift Z, or you can click up here, so this goes into X-ray mode. So before, if we just stayed in this view and we select that and press G, I'll just turn our proportional editing off, press G, we're moving around vertices, but we missed the one that was behind it because we couldn't see it. But if instead we have X-ray vision on, and now we select everything even if it's hidden behind a face. Now we can just sort of move stuff around, make sure these legs are a bit sort of all over the place, like you might expect sort of a lipid to look, a bit of a kink, that sort of thing. And now we have a lipid. Now this isn't necessarily going to be proportional, we're just sort of making a cartoonistic representation of our membrane, but we've got our lipid. If you ever find yourself sort of around here as well, something else I like to do is if you press tilde again, you have something selected, tilde 3, it'll snap your view directly to whatever you have selected. So we have our lipid. Let's go GY, just move that slightly out of the way. And so now comes the new really exciting part that has only just come out with Blender in version 2.92. So if you have a previous version, this won't be available. I'm just going to delete those vertices. So we just work with just our plane. So if we drag this up, and we're going to go into the geometry node editor. Now, geometry nodes is a whole new way of working in Blender. It may seem a bit scary, and if it doesn't quite click with you, just follow along exactly what I'm doing and you should be all right. To get rid of this, you can either sort of click that there, or you can press N to show and hide tools. But what we need to do, you'll notice that there's nothing in here. So we're going to need to click New. And you'll notice over here on the right, it's added something called Geometry Nodes modifier. And so if we zoom in here, we have geometry in and we have geometry out. Now, again, this may seem weird, especially if you're new to 3D, but basically plane is being piped in here. You can do a bunch of operations on it, and then it's being piped out here, and that's what we're seeing. And so what we can actually do is if we say Shift A, so just like in the viewport or in the shader editor, and say point distribute, put our geometry into there and put our geometry into there, you can see it's made a bunch of points. Now, don't think of these as little cubes or circles or anything. These are just individual, basically, points in space, but Blender is representing them as these things so we can actually see them. And if we Shift A and search and join geometry, we can actually see both of them combined. So what this is doing, it's taking the mesh that we're piping in, so our plane, it's distributing points along that plane, and then we're combining it, and that's the output. So if we increase that, you'll see that you're increasing the sort of number of points that are being distributed on that plane. If you've worked with particle systems, this is basically will end up being similar to how we replace particle systems, and that's the point of what Blender is trying to do, is making a far cleaner sort of interface. But we're distributing points all over this plane. It doesn't look that great for a membrane, so what we can actually do is, rather than going random, we can do Poisson disk, or Poisson disk, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that, but we can basically now give it a minimum distance. So if we bring that up, you can say we're now giving it a minimum distance, so those points need to be at least this distance away, and so now it's distributing it evenly. So let's leave that for now. But now we have these points, what we can do, again, Shift A, point, instance, and so we can take each of those points and we can instance an object. And so if we zoom out and we click this little eyedropper, you can click our cube, or you can click here and find your object there. So cube, actually let's rename this cube to lipid. So I just double clicked, or you can press F2, we'll rename something, so lipid. And now we have where each of those points are, our lipid is instanced. You can see if I click off, this disappears. This is actually gets quite annoying. So you can click this little pin, and now if you click off, the geometry nodes that you're currently working on won't disappear. So we have instance, but what we need to do is we want to scale things down. So we want to reduce the size. So if we Shift A, point, scale. Now where you put this is important. If you put it after the instance, and we say vector, scale that down, nothing happens. Because you've already instanced it, then you're scaling, and then things are already happening. So you need to scale your point before you actually make the geometry real. So let's plug that in there, unplug that, and if instead we place that here, you can see that we're scaling the points and the X, Y, and Z. Say we can just change the Z if we want. And it's scaling them, and then it's instancing that new geometry. Now, if you hold Shift and drag, you can adjust multiple things at once inside. Whenever there's multiple little boxes in Blender, you can Shift and drag to do it, or you can do Shift, drag, and then left to right, and it will adjust them all at once. So let's go down to say 0.1. And so we're starting to get, we've got quite big sort of lipids, but I mean, you can do whatever sort of scale you want. Let's go 0.5, 0.05. Looking good. Let's increase, now that we're starting to see where the plane is, we can actually unplug this original geometry, which is the plane. So we'll no longer see it, and we're just seeing the resulting, which is these lipids. So let's decrease the distance. That's looking pretty good. And increase, let's take this up to like 1000 density. And so now we've got a nice, quite natural looking layer. So when you, in other sort of methods of instancing, you can get quite rigid, sort of everything's perfectly in line, and that looks obviously like a computer graphic. So this just looks a bit more natural. I mean, as natural as you can be when you're modeling lipids with a computer. Lipids, a lipid bilayer is by definition a bilayer, so we're going to need a second layer. And so what we can do is we can basically take our points, we can point translate. So after the scale, so it's applied the scale already. This is separate, my apologies. Point translate. We're taking our geometry after the points after they're scaled. And then if we just plugged it straight back in, nothing's really changed, because if we go to the vector, we can see that basically nothing's changed. But if we say drag that down, okay, something's being translated. So we're moving it down on the z-axis by 0.21 meters, and then we're instancing. So what if instead we take this join geometry over here, and we join up this, and we join up this. So we've got our points that are down and our points that are up, and then we instance. Now we have a bilayer. Now again, something's quite wrong, because the bottom ones need to be turned around. So what we can do is Shift A again, point, rotate. So again, we can just rotate them by 180 degrees on the x-axis, and then maybe adjust that some more. And there we go. We have our little bilayer. So if we go into, say, rendered view, you can see there's our bilayer. We might want to add maybe some more randomization to the rotation. So what we can do is, if we can say Shift A, attribute randomize. Now this is where things do get a little confusing. Now this is where things can get a little bit confusing, because we're dealing with things that aren't explained super well in this first iteration of geometry nodes. The later iterations using the next 2.93 alpha, and in later versions this will be much clearer. But I thought I would try and jump in here and just give you a demonstration so you can start playing with it. But basically if you hold Shift right click, you can see it's joined these two together, and you can press G to move that around. This is basically just a way to visually clean things up a little. So the geometry is still going to here, and then it's being fed into here and then into here. And so before that happens, we're going to drag this on top, and we're going to change something. So we're going to change the rotation, and you can see once we've put in rotation, it's now randomizing things a little. And so if we go vector, you can see that we're putting in a min and a max, and then it's then randomizing that rotation. Now, if we select all of those and go 0, so we're no longer randomizing, what we really want to do is just randomize that z. So what it's doing, if we basically plugged this into there, it's just, or even if we plugged that into there, it's randomizing that z, and then it's translating one down, and then we're rotating on the x, and then we've got basically a completely randomized looking bilayer. And so things are looking a bit more quote unquote natural. Now, like I sort of said, the whole point of doing this is that it's completely programmatic. So we can go into our displace modifier here on the right and increase the strength, and you're getting a sort of a bendier looking bilayer. We can, because this is originally built on top of a plane, so we still have that basic plane information. If we press tab, you'll sort of see, maybe it's a little hard to see. If we go into X-ray mode, it's a bit easier to see. We've still got these 4 points. So if you selected these two and press E and extruded, you're seeing that as we're building this new geometry, so this new plane, Blender is taking that information, applying everything in the geometry nodes, and rebuilding basically the brand new bilayer on top of this new plane that you've just made. So you do a little bit of extra work in the setup, setting up this sort of programmatic way of working, and then you can quickly build a longer bilayer. Or we want it even longer. And already you're getting this nice long bilayer, and so you can apply the initial work you've done to basically everything in the future, saving you a lot of time. Now you'll notice that when I go in and out of, actually let's go into solid view. When I go in and out of edit mode, it goes flat and then unflattens. That's because this displace edit mode. So this modifier currently isn't ticked, so it won't show up in edit mode. It only shows up in object mode. So we can click that. And now if I go into edit mode, you'll see the plane is still flat, but the actual modifier is still previewed. So that's maybe a bit better, because now we can say, okay, E, Shift Z, and so now we're making this big plane. And now we're getting a nice looking sort of lipid bilayer. We can basically make some, let's right click that, shade smooth. So already it's looking a bit nicer. We could even go Control 2, so adding a subsurface modifier onto the lipid before it is then done applied onto here. So everything here is now a bit smoother. So if we go, say, back into rendered view, things are looking all right. What I'm going to do is just delete these vertices, delete that, and keep working just for this plane, just so things don't slow down too much. But now we have our plane. Like I've sort of shown, you can adjust the strength of that displacement, or you can even go back into the texture, adjust the size of that cloud that is using to displace it. So that's quite messy looking. You can go bigger. You'll notice that if you're dragging, it sort of stops at 2. That's just sort of like a soft limit. You can now put in, say, 20, and it'll go up to whatever you put in. But when you're clicking and dragging, Blender limits it to a certain number, but you can usually override that with certain defaults. And so you can sort of see, let's drag to maybe something like that, and just reduce that strength to maybe something like that. So we want to add a protein to our lipid bilayer to complete our scene. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to open up in Chimera. So I'm working with 6WZG, which is a GPCR. Now this is a structure from a friend of mine, Sarah Piper. So this is the structure I'm going to work with. Now, because previously we've been putting our proteins just randomly in space, with a membrane protein, you need to make sure it's properly in the membrane. So if you're familiar with the structure, or you have the structure inside a membrane, you're all good. But if you're working with a protein that you don't necessarily know how it should look in a membrane, you can basically copy the code and go to this memprotein MD, and you can search it. And I say, cool, there's the protein, and here is what it should look like inside a membrane. So this is basically run some MD simulations and found where the membrane should sit and how it should look inside that membrane. So we've got this main sort of alpha helical region here, which is the hydrophobic region, and that is where the membrane goes. So in terms of in Chimera, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to hide that and go into molecule display, show the surface. Now, depending on what you're trying to show in your scene, the typical sort of surface representation may or may not be what you're after. So if this is what you're after, cool, save your file, you're good to go. But what I want to do is go surface resolution 10. And so basically it's going to recalculate the surface with a slightly lower resolution. Well, higher resolution number, but lower resolution. And so everything's a bit blobbier looking. And personally, especially when you're going into large complex scenes, if you're dealing with a surface that, say, of a resolution of, say, 6 or even 4, while it is, I suppose you could say, like, more accurate, it's more visually distracting, because in this sort of structure you have, oh, that's not quite what we would expect. Let's go 5. In, say, this structure, you're seeing all these like nooks and crannies that your brain is having to process, that sort of 3D information, that shading, but really it's not serving a huge amount of purpose, because overall what we want is this overall structure. And so something that looks maybe a bit blobbier, while, you know, if we were doing some kind of analysis, would be bad, because we want all of that minute detail that we can really dig around in and do some analysis on. But when you're visually trying to communicate something, the simpler it is, and the quicker that your brain can pass that information, the more sort of satisfying looking the actual animation or visualization. So resolution of around 10, I like the look of. So if we go CD to the desktop and save surface.glb, jump over into Blender, file, import, GLB, desktop, surface, And so now if we zoom out, we'll see that our structure's all the way up there, so it's massive. So with your structure selected, so it should be selected when you're initially importing it. Scale, I'm just going to go 0.1 on the keyboard. And that should scale it down. We're going to scale it even more, so scale 0.2. And again, I can go tilde3 to sort of zoom in on it. We're starting to get the scale, so let's just scale it a little bit more, 0.5. That's sort of looking more like it. Okay, so my screencast keys have stopped for some reason, and I'm not entirely sure why, so I apologize. But I will continue on. So we have our structure. If we go into rendered view, we'll see that it's blank. So we can, in geometry nodes, or even, actually I might just drag over a new window. So if you haven't seen in a previous video I've done or in another one, if you're in the bottom corner or one of the corners of any tab in Blender, basically, you'll get this little icon up here. You can click and drag, and that'll create a whole new window, which we can then say go to our shader editor. And so now we can click new. So this is now driving the shader for this. So if I say red, it will go red. Now, as we learned in the previous video, we can say Shift A, vertex color, and it will take basically the color information that it had inside Blender, inside Chimera, and pipe that and use that in Blender. Now, what we can do is, if we look at this, so this is this one, what you'll see is that it hasn't applied it to the other ones, but if we go shift click, and you can see inside Blender that while you can have multiple things highlighted, one object is sort of selected inside that highlight. And so with the surfaces highlighted, but importantly the surface that has this material already applied to it, extra highlighted, and you can do that by holding down Control and left clicking. You'll change what you're currently highlighting. If you just click, it'll change it. But if we shift click and then Control click, that'll change what you have like selected inside your highlight. We can do inside the viewport, Control L, and we can link. So we're going to link materials. You can also do that inside object. There should be a make links and materials, but you can see that the little shortcut is Control L. So if we do Control L, materials, now you can see that basically every one of these surfaces has the same material. And while inside the material we're not setting a different color, each of these surfaces had different vertex colors, as we saw in the previous video, and it's using that to then color the actual surface itself. Inside that, basically what we can do now is if we drag and select all of those, we can say Control J, which will join them all into one mesh. And if we right click and change the origin point, so if I just Control Z that, the origin point was over here. So if I move it around like that, it'll rotate around the origin point. So escape to cancel that. If we right click, set origin, origin to geometry, the origin is now in the middle of the actual protein itself. What we can do now is press R. So if you press R, it'll move perpendicular to the camera, and press R again, it'll sort of rotate on the spot. And we can move that basically into our membrane. So GZ, let's make this bigger so you can see. But you can also, when you're trying to position things in 3D space, sometimes it's good to just look from one particular direction. So while you can click and drag on this up here to move around, if you click, it'll go orthographic projection from just one view. And then if you hold shift middle click and move around, you can sort of see it from different perspectives. So if we go from the X, we go maybe to here, line it up, and we go from the Y, maybe about to there. And now we can see it's sitting nicely in that membrane. And so the protein itself is actually a little bit bigger than what we would expect from how it is positioned in the membrane. So what we're going to do is just scale it slightly down. GZ, And that's looking pretty good. If we look through our camera, it's looking good. What we might do is GZZ, zoom in. What you can do to help you basically position the camera is if you press N, to bring up this tool menu, and so you'll probably have item or something selected. If you go to view, you'll see this camera to view and to 3D cursor. So if we click camera to view, now if we move our view around, it'll basically, the camera will stick with us. So now we can middle mouse click and move around, shift middle mouse, drag around. Oh, my screencast keys are back. I don't know where they went, but they're back now. And so now we can sort of move that around, set up our scene, and we can turn that off. Press N to hide that away. So now we've got our scene. Press F12. Cool, so basics of our scene is basically set up. We can do the same thing we've done with our lipids, but we can do it with our protein as well, all inside geometry nodes. So let's say we're going to need to point distribute again. So we're taking our plane geometry, we're distributing a point, we're going to need much less density. So let's zoom in so we can see what we're doing. Let's go 3, or let's go 10, and 0.5. And now let's take our point instance, and we are going to instead include our protein surface. We're going to plug that in, and then we're going to, if we say just plug that into our output, you would see, we zoom out, that things are massive and looking weird. So what's happening is we've scaled our protein down, but we haven't applied our scale. So let's unplug that, plug that back in. So if we just say Control A and apply scale, so we don't want to do all transforms, let's just apply a scale and apply a rotation. And now if we plug that in, things are looking less weird, so they're still massive, so I'm still not entirely sure what's going on there. But what we can fix that the same way we fix the lipids, basically. So if we add another one of this, so if we grab this point scale, Shift D to duplicate, and put it on top of that, you can already see it's decreasing that size. We want to decrease that even more. So let's go 0.005. Much better. And let's 0.01. There we go. So size-wise, it's looking basically exactly the same as our first one. And if we join geometry, you can see that it's placing them inside the membrane. What we might want to... No, that's looking good. What we might want to do, though, is if we press Tab into edit mode and GZ and just bring that up slightly, it'll bring them all up. And left click and then press Tab to come out of it. What we needed to do, basically, is because even no matter where this is, the way Blender actually instances the geometry is where this point of origin is. So the point of origin was slightly higher. So if you go into edit mode, you can adjust where the mesh is relative to the point of origin. So I'm pressing G, so we can see the point of origin is still here, but I've adjusted the mesh. And so you can see all the copies in the background disappearing, basically. So if we press escape to cancel that, press tab. So now things are being instanced properly. Let's increase the distance. So there's a few less of them. Let's go even more. Let's go 10. And now what we can do, click on that. Let's go 2. Now, if we E to extrude, we're just making a membrane with our protein distributed all over it. Okay, so I've just made some adjustments. So I've just moved my camera over here, so it's now looking at our primary protein here. Here's our membrane with everything instanced on it. I'm just gonna basically take this edge, E shift Z, so I move it perpendicular, bring that out there so that you can't sort of basically see anything. Cool. And now we're gonna maybe adjust that density and adjust that seed. Cool. So things are in our basic sort of scene. What I will do is now in the camera you can enable a depth of field. The focus on object, we're just going to select our primary protein, and if we bring our f-stop down, you can see that the focus is on our protein. Everything else is sort of sitting on the membrane in the scene. If you press F12, you can get a pretty basic sort of render of maybe your protein in a membrane. You can label stuff if you want. Currently we've been using EV. You can switch over to cycles. So GPU compute. Well, probably what you want to do is go edit preferences, system, and you can, if you support optics, you can turn on your GPU for either CUDA and optics. I use optics because thankfully I have one of the new 3090s. Just use my GPU. That'll shoot through and render that nice and quickly. Now, so we've got our scene. You'll notice that obviously the membrane is just plain, so we can, if we want, select that, and we could add a shader to it. So new, maybe something slightly yellowish. If you want to color, say, the tails and also the heads of the lipids differently, if we go over to our lipid and press tab, if we select, actually let's press 3 and select, so now we're selecting the faces. So if we select everything on that, everything on that, so we've got all the faces selected of our legs. And if we go over to our shader little tab here, so this little circle, what you can do is you can assign shaders to different parts of the lipids. So with this selected, you can say assign. We can add another shader, and if you press Control I, you'll invert your selection. So we've changed our, we can see that we've actually missed some stuff. I'm gonna turn that off. So I'm shift clicking to deselect. I'm gonna press Control I, assign, Control I, let's say new shader, assign, and we're gonna turn this into green. So now if we go into rendered view, you can see our legs of our lipid and our head is different. So inside our little render, you can even go, let's go, yeah, just slightly different sort of shades I'm liking. We've got our membrane protein. We've got our lipids. Do a little test render. And so you've got your sort of molecular scene. And like I was sort of saying, it is procedurally generated. So we can jump out into here, click on this, and adjust this however you want, and it'll basically regenerate that scene, which is the real power of it. Now, this is going to go really, really dense, really, really complex in the future, and I'm really excited for where this is going to go. But currently, we'll probably leave it off there because already this is going to be a really long video, and I just thought how I would show you the basics of geometry nodes. I recommend having a play around with geometry nodes. There's lots of other really great tutorials. I sort of brushed the surface of some of it. If you like the idea of this sort of procedural generation, there's lots of really great tutorials out there. This is just a basic way to basically make a membrane with it and whack a protein on there as well. And if you're going to make this sort of membrane scene, you want to make it sort of a bit nicer, you might add some particles above and below to sort of make it look like a cellular scene, add some other proteins on here. So you can do that basically the same way as we've done here. You can manually place them. But again, this is already a really long video, so I'm going to leave it there. I might, if people want, pick up from this scene or from another membrane scene and sort of build up a more complex membrane scene and sort of show you how to do that. but this is sort of just going to be an intro to how to initially make this membrane and how to wax some proteins onto it. But let's just crank up that. Let's just turn that up to say 1024. Let's crank up the render. Leave that rendering. So, like I sort of said, thank you so much for all of the support and all the really kind comments. I'm glad to see that people are excited that I'm making videos again. There's lots more topics to cover. I know I've said I will do animation, and I'm getting there. I really want to show you how to sort of animate stuff, and especially molecular dynamics. Please do please do subscribe. It really helps, like I said, motivation, the channel, and also sharing it with other people by liking and subscribing. So I really appreciate that. So please do continue to do that. Please do continue to share feedback with me. Tweet at me with renders that you've made. So I'm at Brady A. Johnston on Twitter, because I love to see that this stuff is getting used. I've seen that it's, people have sent me stuff that they've made that's now in Nature, and it's being used in the New York Times and all sorts of stuff. So it's really cool to see that I am helping enable people to make cooler, more compelling graphics. So yeah, please do like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.